There are certain experiences in the analytic setting in which interpretation or amplification plays far less a role than the direct discovery of unconscious factors that control the analytical process. To a large degree, these experiences, which take place between myself and the analysand, call upon our so-called adult sides, or, in other terms, the therapeutic alliance. I have come to believe that the form in which one searches for an unconscious controlling factor has a good deal to do with creating and strengthening this alliance. Here I shall be concerned with the unconscious couple, and generally I shall be dealing with male-female imagery. An unconscious couple is sometimes discovered in memories related to parental interactions. Often these were tortuous events in which became a familial way of life. A child may have tried to protect one parent from the other, or himself from both. Such experiences formed a continual traumatic process, which then became an unconscious model for life. Frequently they become embedded in the psyche as images of a sadomasochistic couple. Traumatic experiences, as Levi-Strauss noted in his analysis of healing in primitive cultures, have a capacity to induce an emotional crystallization which is molded by pre-existing structures. These structures, in this case negative, are fusion forms of the archetypal union known as the conjunctio in alchemy. They are truly atemporal. At times we can discover and imaginally experience these underlying archetypal structures and eventually regain them in positive form. The essence of what I want to convey here is as follows. First, there is the discovery of an unconscious couple. Two people can then become aware of the fact that while they believed they were behaving in a conscious manner, their feelings and actions were to a large degree being organized by an unconscious couple, managing them as though they were obedient machines. Second, there is the crucial question, the main concern actually, of where this couple exists. It can exist as internal structure in the patient or in the analyst, but there is a third possibility, which to me has unusual merit. This couple may exist in the space between. Exploring the qualities of this space, which is akin to, but also different from Winnicott's description of transitional space, leads to the long-discarded notion of the subtle body. The subtle body concept. The notion that the physical body of man is, as it were, the exteriorization of an invisible, subtle embodiment of the life of the mind is a very ancient belief. With these words written in 1919, G.R.S. Mead introduced his book, The Doctrine of the Subtle Body in Western Tradition. His comments are still cogent, and I quote, "It is, however, the prevailing habit of skeptical rationalism of the present day to dismiss summarily all such beliefs of antiquity as the basic dreams of a pre-scientific age. I am persuaded that, the more deeply modern research penetrates into the more recondite regions of biology, psychophysiology, and psychology, the more readily will reason be inclined to welcome the notion as a fertile working hypothesis to coordinate a considerable number of the mental, vital, and physical phenomena of human personality which otherwise remain on our hands as a confused and inexplicable conglomerate." End quote. The subtle body can be experienced imaginally as a kind of energy field that extends outwards from our physical being. It is invisible to ordinary perceptions, but can be seen imaginally. Through clinical material, I shall show how it appears in the context of two people in analysis. Their subtle bodies can interact and manifest in states of fusion, or, the extreme opposite, in a state of separation that can become extremely afflicted and persecutory in its soullessness. They may also interact in the conjunctio, that mysterious state described by Winnicott, in which separation is not a separation, but a form of union. Before fully explaining why I find it important to consider the subtle body concept as clinically useful, I wish to take note of A. Mendel's book called The Dream Body. Mendel has shown how phenomena we normally consider to be psychic and relate to as affect tone images can also be approached from a more embodied point of view. In a sense, Mendel took up a distinction Jung made between the psychic and somatic unconscious in his unpublished Seminars on Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra from 1934 to 1939, where he carefully showed how psychic imagery could be reflected through the somatic unconscious. It is not the existence of the subtle body that should be at issue. We are at that stage in our development, as predicted by Mead and exemplified, for example, by Mendel's work, at which we can be relatively comfortable with an attitude that is rooted in the reality of the imagination. When we deal with the subtle body, we are concerned not with ordinary perceptions, but with imaginal ones. Those who can see will do so. Others will remain skeptical. There are clinicians, however, who are quite aware of the existence of such subtle body phenomena, but also question the suitability of the concept for clinical practice. That is a far more important issue. Is the notion of the subtle body deleterious, and that it may shift attention away from the importance of the physical body, especially of body energies and associated sexual states of mind in analysis? Is the subtle body so impossible to explain in terms that are communicable as to run the danger of our clinical efforts becoming mired in confusion which passes off as mystery? The phenomena I shall be considering do not require any change of the normal analytic attitude or setting. In fact, they are enhanced and properly controlled by it. There is a great deal of wisdom in the analytical attitude, especially in its concern with dreams and with transference. But I think we are at that stage that Ferenczi spoke of when he said that we must return to animism on a new level after we have integrated psychoanalytic understanding. Two people can become aware of a state in which their subtle bodies are interacting. This is often felt as a change in the quality of space between them. It is experienced as energized and more material in nature. They are then at the threshold of an awareness of archetypal processes, a mundus imaginalis, as it was designated by Henry Corbin. Recently, Andrew Samuels has persuasively argued there is a, quote, two-person or shared mundus imaginalis which is constellated in analysis, end quote. This imaginal realm is what Jung, following tradition, called the unus mundus, and what David Bohm in physics, devising his own terminology, has called the implicate order. By this, Bohm means a primary level of reality with its own laws, not yet fully understood, and out of which the world as we know it, the separate events in a space-time framework, manifests as the explicate order. The implicate order is characterized by oneness, whose essence is carried throughout the implicate order. It has a holographic structure, through which any part contains the whole. Events in the explicate order enter the implicate order and are, in Bohm's terms, enfolded there, so that they spread over the entire implicate order. As these appear in time-space, they separate out again as discrete events. Bohm's position is that we must reorient our thinking back towards such notions of order and away from our Cartesian models if we are to ever make sense of the physical universe. As far as I can tell, his position is a restatement of ancient notions of a unus mundus structured by archetypes, but with attention to the interaction between this unitary world and space-time events. As his ideas develop, we may find more and more importance in them for psychological models. His special contribution for our purpose lies in his fresh view of the subject and in his critique of the limits of Newtonian and Cartesian approaches, which still, I may add, dominate most thinking in psychoanalysis, especially in object relations theory. Whether we deal with complexes or with developmental stages such as the depressive position, Mahler's separation-individuation process with its rapprochement crises, with Oedipal levels, and so forth, we are dealing with what can be observed or inferred in time-space considerations. But these are only fragments that stem from a vastly larger process of the unus mundus. This, to paraphrase Bohm, is a vast energy sea. Its processes can be imaginally grasped and known through mutual subtle body experience. The central structure of the background realm that can be encountered by two people through subtle body experience is the conjunctio, an archetypal form of union. This is often an event and an ensuing process, felt to occur in a space that is at least partially created by their subtle bodies. When the conjunctio is an active imaginal experience, both people will feel a sense of alternately being pulled together towards fusion and then pulled apart towards separation, while in the realm between them there is a continual sense of unity. The conjunctio experience has this rhythmic quality, which is characteristic of archetypal processes. It is a form of union characteristic of this level of reality, and it can be known and experienced in the kind of subtle body interactions I am here concerned with. Experiencing the conjunctio is a source of healing for developmental failures in those key phases in personality development in which opposites combine. For example, the depressive position and the rapprochement subphase of the separation-individuation process. Such subtle body encounters strengthen psychic structure and build a firmer mind-body unity, one which is less afflicted by splitting and defensive projective identification. The subtle body as an intermediate realm. Jungians have given attention to the body in the past. Notably, Whitmont has done this, and this interest has lately increased, for example, by Green, Woodman, and Chodorow. Clinical material can often be approached with reference to either body or psyche. For example, a 23-year-old male suffering from occasional impotence, complaining of extreme inertia, masturbatory compulsions, and an inability to control his use of marijuana recalled the following childhood experience. At the age of 7, he became frightened by the Popeye character called Alice the Goon. At night he would imagine her in his bedroom. She would be immense, and this terrified him. The only way he could protect himself against her was by pulling the covers tightly up to his chin so that only his head showed. This ritual occurred for the next 7 years, and it only stopped when he discovered masturbation and marijuana and used them compulsively to block his anxiety attacks. His body posture had the look of someone with the covers pulled up. As he would breathe in and then hold his breath for what seemed like an interminable time, his body from the chest down would pull inward towards the back of the chair and somewhat recede from view, as if it were covered up. Holding his breath seemed to reduce him to a head, with his body stiffly cut off from any signs of life. He would then spasmodically release his breath. Then the covers would be pulled up again, so to speak. His body would become rigid, and the sudden and forceful release of his breath would eventually follow. The treatment only marginally addressed his breathing patterns and character armoring. Instead, it focused upon his parental complexes, and was especially fruitful when his hatred of sexuality could be explored. This intense reaction took the form of a revulsion towards foreplay. As a result of this brief one-year treatment, his masturbatory compulsion ceased. He entered into a relationship with a woman his age, and his addiction to marijuana, while not ending, strongly diminished. His breathing pattern improved, but he still retained that quality of pulling up the covers. This brief vignette shows how an intense negative mother complex manifested itself through body and psyche. As a result of my particular training at the time, I chose to work with psychic complexes. Someone else may have approached this young man's problems through his body armoring and breathing patterns. My approach was moderately successful. A body-oriented therapy would, I am certain, also have been at least as fruitful. The patient employed splitting defenses against the threat of being overwhelmed by psychotic anxieties. Mind-body splitting was his major defense. Whether pulling up the covers in actuality, just to his chin, as in his childhood ritual, or as this later became a metaphor for his body structure, he was splitting off body awareness. Clearly, his intense anxieties lived, so to speak, in his body, and could be hidden there as long as his splitting defenses worked. While his anxiety level was high, untempered by drug use, his body and breathing pattern was gripped in the kind of rigidity I have described. This is a very general pattern. Any time a complex is constellated and threatens to assimilate ego functions, the body ego takes on a pattern associated with the complex. In relationship to a complex constellation, there is not only an array of physiological responses such as changes in respiration, heart rate, and galvanic skin response, demonstrated by Jung in his word association experiments, but there is a change in the overall body structure. Psychically, this is experienced as a body image. When the man I described was threatened by his negative mother complex, his body image was of being in pieces, ugly, and filled with repulsive desires. His physical body also took on the characteristic form of hiding, pulling up the covers up to his chin. One way of synthesizing these observations is as follows. Every complex has a body. The body of the complex is neither the physical body nor a purely mental structure, but an in-between phenomenon. In Mead's words, it is an invisible, subtle embodiment of the life of the mind. The subtle body can manifest itself psychically in terms of dream, fantasy, and body images, and it can manifest physically in terms of body structure. It is both spiritual and physical, and rather than studying one or the other of these opposites, I shall show, through clinical material, that there is much to be gained by attending instead, and when possible, to that often obscure middle realm of which they both partake. This intermediate realm of subtle bodies was the major concern of alchemy. When in Paracelsus we read his common refrain, "Destroy the bodies," he is speaking, I believe, about transforming the body of the complex. In bioenergetic work, one attempts to break down body armoring. That is an approach on the physical body level, but not on the subtle body level. The latter requires the imagination, the key, as Jung has said, to the entire alchemical opus. If one can successfully work through the subtle body realm, there is often a chance to transform not only psychic structure, but physical structure as well. Mind-body splitting can mend when the subtle body realm is successfully encountered. While in Psychology and Alchemy, Jung gives a survey of the alchemist's use of the subtle body idea, in his unpublished seminars on Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, he develops the subtle body idea more fully than anywhere in his collected works. He tells us that the psyche has real effects which are performed through the medium called the subtle body. Projections are transmitted through this medium and manifest in physical and psychic effects from one person to another. To this I would like to add that the medium, the subtle body, may be projected and imaginally perceived as operating between people. Furthermore, the intermediate, subtle body realm can be a conjoined body, made up of the individual subtle bodies of two people in analysis. This particular form of the subtle body experience is our main interest. It is this kind of imagery that we meet in the alchemical treatise, the Rosarium Philosophorum, which Jung took as an Ariadne thread, as he says, through the complexities of the transference. Winnicott's discovery of transitional space and phenomena stem, I believe, from subtle body perceptions, something Andrew Samuels has noted. Winnicott says, "My claim is that there is an intermediate area of experiencing, to which inner reality and external life both contribute. It is an area that is not challenged, because no claim is made on its behalf except that it shall exist as a resting place for the individual engaged in the perpetual human task of keeping inner and outer reality separate yet interrelated." He goes on, "I am here staking a claim for an intermediate state between a baby's inability and his growing ability to recognize and accept reality. I am therefore studying the substance of illusion, that which is allowed to the infant and which in adult life is inherent in art and religion, and yet becomes the hallmark of madness when an adult puts too powerful a claim on the credulity of others, forcing them to acknowledge a sharing of illusion that is not their own. We can share a respect for illusory experience, and if we wish, we may collect together and form a group on the basis of similarity of our illusory experiences." End quote. We need something of Winnicott's courage when attempting to describe subtle body phenomena, for we are dealing with illusions, and while a good deal can be said about the reality of the imagination, or about its potential for perceiving, quote, "the intermediate area between the subjective and that which is objectively perceived," end quote, we are nevertheless confronted with an exceptionally difficult task of communicating our imagination in some understandable form. The subtle body in clinical practice. For many reasons, I think we need to introduce the subtle body concept into actual clinical practice. The most immediate one is that actively engaging its dynamics often works where all other approaches, whether they be purely interpretive, interactive field concepts, gestalt enactments, or bodywork of various kinds, have little effect. But there is a larger issue at stake. As mentioned already, it is likely, I believe, that much of the phenomenology we tend to take as the primary data of the analytic endeavor may be secondary to an underlying process that is outside of our normal sense of time and space. They are possibly secondary in the same way that Bohm finds the quarks and profusions of particles in physics to be secondary manifestations of a usually unknown larger process. In Jung's terminology, which has roots in its cultural predecessors, we deal with manifestations of processes in the unus mundus that synchronistically manifest in time. Once there, these processes may be understood culturally and structured developmentally, but it is an open issue if that is the best way to understand and set right their pathology. Major developmental processes can be seen as reflections of aspects of the process of union in the unus mundus. The experience of union through the medium of the subtle body is one in which the conjoining and separation of opposites rhythmically alternate in a frequency pattern, while a sense of oneness permeates. But in observations set in a space-time framework, these aspects appear to be separated and are not conceived of as various stages or aspects of an underlying oneness of existence. Key developmental issues, such as those that Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid and the depressive positions, and what Margaret Mahler called the rapprochement subphase of the separation individuation process, can be seen as processes in space-time which reflect the event of the conjunctio and other processes that attend it in the unus mundus. But these events can readily lose contact with their source, the vast energy sea of the unus mundus, and especially so when they are further cast into a developmental framework. This is not to criticize the value of developmental models, but to fully partake of their value, the archetypal source of the events they sequentially structure as stages in development must not drift into a dim metapsychological background. Furthermore, developmental theories themselves need to be related to their sources in archetypal patterns. The paranoid schizoid position can be seen to accord with picture 7 of the Rosarium, the ascent of the soul, which Jung likens to a schizophrenic dissociation. It is a state in which all linking, to use Bion's term, is attacked, something the alchemists speak of as a loss of the vinculum, the connecting function of the soul. Seen from the perspective of an ego entering time-space, this state can represent intense anxiety that must be sufficiently neutralized by, to use Winnicott's phrase, good enough mothering. But what is the function of this intense persecutory anxiety? Since it is sometimes linked to an abandonment anxiety, it is often considered to instigate the dissolution of omnipotence. Persecutory anxiety of the paranoid schizoid position is linked by Klein to the death instinct, and in Freud's view, the death instinct drives the ego towards an eros relationship to objects so that it desires to love and be loved. In Bion's view, the paranoid schizoid state can dissolve psychic structure or containers so that new ones and new thoughts can develop. This gets closer to what we can learn from imagery such as that in the Rosarium. There, the purpose of this extremely disorienting state is to transform personality structure and especially body armoring to allow a new embodiment of union. That is, the pictures of the Rosarium depict the soul's experience of union, the conjunctio of king and queen, which is an event largely outside of time-space, ever occurring in the unus mundus, and occasionally experienced by the human soul, an event which is in the process of incarnating. This cannot happen if the body armoring and early personal shadow material are rigidly organized. In terms of the Rosarium, which is to say of processes in the unus mundus as apprehended through the subtle body experience, the stage of the ascent of the soul Picture 7. The intense persecutory energy fields which attack all connections with oneself and others must be seen as a vital and important state. It prepares for and allows the eventual embodiment of the self as a union of opposites. There is a great difference if one can experience these death-dealing affects with a viewpoint that they have a purpose that is genuinely mysterious. Winnicott's brilliant observation that the self is created through the continuous destruction of fantasy objects that somehow survive certainly helps. One can at times experience these devastating interactive fields with an awareness or faith in a basic oneness of which they partake. As this intense anxiety is part of a process of embodiment, one task of the analyst is to faithfully become embodied amidst them. This is extremely difficult since his survival as a self is uncertain. This is thinking along alchemical lines, and it corresponds with Bion's notion of faith in what he called O. The depressive position is one in which opposites such as good and bad breast combine into a whole object, with depression or pining often taken to be a result of the child's awareness of harm it may now also do to the good breast. Klein suggested that in the depressive position, the omnipotence of the good and bad mother is lost, and with it the child's sense of omnipotence. This loss is also taken to be responsible for the depressive position. Other explanations have been given as well. Elkins suggests that, quote, it is not the question of impotence or omnipotence that gets to the core of the depressive position, but rather the infant's new capacity to distinguish physical omnipotence from mental omniscience, end quote. These are all ways of apprehending in space-time considerations a process that follows the conjunctio in the unus mundus. This process is called the nigredo, picture 6 of the Rosarium. The depressive position looks very different when viewed from a vantage point of an ego seeking outer objects, from that of a soul experiencing inner and outer union. The setup is not dissimilar from how incest can be viewed, with Freud's emphasis upon the taboo which leads to separation, and Jung's on incest as the drive to union. From the point of view of subtle body experiences of the conjunctio, what we understand as the depressive position is a stage of mourning for a loss of fusion with archetypal dominance and union, the king and queen of the Rosarium. The depressive position would be understood as such as a result of a union of opposites and a loss of omnipotence, in Klein's sense, and as a result of distinguishing physical omnipotence from mental omniscience, in Elkin's sense. But more, it would be seen as a stage of mourning, not primarily to repair injury inflicted on a single good and bad object by unconscious destructive fantasy life, but mourning for a loss of direct contact with the archetypal sphere, a loss of the beauty and numinous quality of union. This cannot be cast with any sufficiency into a loss of a primal scene fantasy, unless the latter is taken to be a projection of the archetypal drama of the union, king and queen. In the paranoid schizoid position, the soul is beset with a separation from its union with God, the unio mystica. In the depressive position, the soul must separate from the experience of union as a haros gamos, the sacred marriage of opposites. These are different experiences of union, one more concerned with logos and light, and the other with eros. The developing or incarnating soul must separate from both in order that the product of union may eventually incarnate. The rapprochement subphase of separation-individuation process also can be seen as a space-time fragment of the conjunctio. The child's separation and return, the latter so filled with energy, may again, as in the depressive position, represent the conjunctio process and its affects as they fall, with much diminished energy value into space-time. In the depressive position, the opposites unite in the backbone of the child's psyche, while the child is still in fusion with the sacred event. In the rapprochement subphase, the child is more an actor in the drama of union, but it is an attempt at union that falls into discrete parts, a separation and a return, opposites that attempt to harmonize but lack the glue of unity, as it can be known in the archetypal rhythmical quality of the conjunctio. Instead, Mother and child must sufficiently, but always incompletely, create it. Seeking unity, the archetypal root of rapprochement, may underpin this phase being seen as something that is a lifelong endeavor. But experiencing the prototype of this process, the conjunctio in the subtle body realm, can often both reveal and heal separation and rapprochement wounds, the main focus of borderline disorders. The Oedipal stage represents yet another pattern of the joining of opposites and their separation. Again, the opposites contained by the conjunctio in the unus mundus. In the Oedipal level, the ego is getting near to the culmination of its sacrifice of fusion with the numinous energy of union. Libido now cast under the control of the incest taboo. From Layard and Jung, we have learned that this sacrifice allows for the development of inner structure, especially in the sphere of a differentiated relationship to the feminine and to culture. All of this reflects the conjunctio in the subtle body experience, in which kinship libido is created and inner structures, especially anima and animus, are transformed. It is the danger of fusion with the archetypal sphere that requires the incest taboo and the Oedipal transit. Yet its rewards are very indirect and fragmentary relative to the imaginal experience of its prototype, the conjunctio. When the subtle body experience is constellated between two people, both people begin to gain access to knowing experientially the kind of phenomenology that Jung discusses in his work on the Rosarium. These images are an example of the process that structures the subtle body experience, and the central event in that process, which organizes all others, is the conjunctio. That is why nearly all of my clinical material will revolve about this state. Healing and the conjunctio. Experiencing the conjunctio as a here and now, imaginal reality can contribute to healing the mad parts of psyche, parts in which mindlessness dominates, thinking is broken, and a sense of personal continuity lost. A mother may cure or mend such ruptures in psychic structure and, as Winnicott said, reestablish the baby's capacity to use a symbol of union. The conjunctio may have this potential also, when it is imaginally experienced in the analytic setting. It should be noted that a good deal of healing and analysis can occur without explicit experience of the conjunctio, without imaginal sight. In The Psychology of the Transference, Jung says that this event often passes off in the unconscious, its occurrence unknown at the time. Healing, as Judith Hubeck has shown with reference to depressed patients, can often be understood as the patient's introjection of the analyst's conscious-unconscious union. This process may underlie healing in numerous other instances. Any time an interpretation is value, it is not likely that its value stems from an increase in the patient's cognitive mastery of conflict, nor is it a result of the affective experience that a good interpretation may facilitate. These are phenomena which are relatively visible and tangible. The primary source of healing lies in the process the analyst and patient have lived through, the process whereby the analyst has been able to maintain a self, to recover an imagination and capacity to think while bombarded by projective and introjective processes whose goal is to attack linking and imagination. Imagination or thoughts that the analyst or patient may have amid such destructive field phenomena are rarely the result of a discursive thinking process. They are created, the child of a union. In Meltzer's phrase, the child of a combined object. The imaginal archetypal couple, the conjunctio, is the source of healing that can be introjected by the patient and, it should be added, by the therapist as well. The conjunctio may be a more or less unconscious phenomena, whose existence we sense or intuit on the edges of consciousness, much like the unconscious dyad that Andre Green finds so crucial to analytics. It is likely that the conjunctio underpins the secured space that is central to the theory of Robert Lange's. Considerable therapeutic value can accrue from the conjunctio as a more or less unconscious phenomena between analyst and patient. Strong sexual feelings often emerge with the stirring of the conjunctio, and a person can fear being overwhelmed, or fears and senses the analytic process cannot contain such affects. In these situations, a good deal of preliminary effort through interpretive or body work is first necessary. The imaginal process may be ill-advised when, to use Masood Khan's terminology, symbiotic omnipotence is a dominant factor. Generally, when a patient uses fusion to hide and control a psychotic kernel, the imaginal activity that goes into the discovery or creation of the conjunctio can unleash an unmanageable psychotic transference. Raising the conjunctio to an imaginal here-and-now awareness is a process like the alchemical elixir that can be a poison or a cure. It can be so destructive that, if I did not believe, based on a good deal of clinical evidence, that the imaginal experience of the conjunctio and its associated process has a value often not readily achieved by interpretive, analytical, spiritual, or body techniques, including the more unconscious occurrence of the conjunctio, that I would not suggest that we seriously re-examine its manifestations as a viable clinical factor. The somatic unconscious and the subtle body. In his Nietzsche seminars, Jung makes an extremely clear statement about the subtle body. He tells us that the subtle body refers to that part of the unconscious which becomes more and more identical with the functioning of the body, growing darker and darker and ending in the utter darkness of matter. For this reason, he explains, the subtle body is exceedingly incomprehensible. But Jung must bring it into his analysis of Zarathustra because, he tells us, Nietzsche's concept of the self includes the body, and this cannot be reduced to the psychological shadow. Cannot be reduced to the psychological shadow. That's important. The latter forms the part of the psychological or psychic, while the subtle body represents the somatic unconscious, the unconscious as it is experienced as we descend into the body. Having stated his wariness of employing the subtle body concept, Jung goes on to display a mastery of the subject. He tells us that the subtle body must be beyond space and time. In fact, that it must be a body that does not fill space. When he sufficiently deals with the intellectual difficulties of the subject, he then tells us that the subtle body is a very important concept. Quote, "It is marvelous to encounter it in a text which naively comes from the wholeness of man. Zarathustra is one of those books that is written with blood, and anything written with blood contains the notion of the subtle body, the equivalent of the somatic unconscious." End quote. Jung goes on to raise key issues. The subtle body is extremely important, but can it be made comprehensible? For the grasp of these phenomena depends upon the speaking in images and hence upon imagination. Jung's concern with being scientific led him to rarely deal with the subtle body concept in his collected works, except to explain its significance in alchemy and in the process, by the way, revealing a mine of information on the subject. A few notable exceptions can be found. For example, in his essay Psychology and Religion, he writes, quote, "Our usual materialistic conception of the psyche is, I am afraid, not particularly helpful in cases of neurosis. If only the soul were endowed with a subtle body, then one could at least say that this breath or vapor body was suffering from a real though somewhat ethereal cancer, in the same way that the gross material body can succumb to cancerous disease." End quote. And, to quote another source, "I have often felt tempted to advise my patients to think of the psyche as a subtle body in which subtle tumors can grow." End quote. Jung's concern was with the comprehensibility of the subtle body concept. Can we employ it without degenerating into a vague kind of primary process thinking? I think it can be made sufficiently comprehensible. Clinical examples will portray the imaginal processes that come into play. At times, a couple may just find themselves in a subtle body encounter. At other times, an imaginal technique must be employed. Alchemy, with its concern for the imaginatio, conceived to be half spiritual, half physical, and, as Jung said, the most important key to the understanding of the opus," end quote, has at times cast the imaginal process into an obscure saying, the so-called axiom of Maria. The qualitative logic of the enigmatic axiom runs as follows. Out of the one comes the two, out of the two comes the three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. This axiom is a way of apprehending processes in the unus mundus as they intersect with space-time perceptions. The path that the axiom sets out is one that can lead into an awareness of the subtle body and into its central ordering structure, the conjunctio. A clinical vignette, an example of the axiom of Maria, or this case of Kate. Kate sits down and says, quote, "Everything is okay. Life was never better," end quote. As she continues talking, I feel both uncontacted and I tend to not make any contact myself. I tend to withdraw, straining to respond in some mirroring way and feeling false if I try too much. Yet this all feels inadequate, very uncomfortable. I think of changing the subject and almost say, "How are you doing in your business?" But that I quickly recognize would only have been a way of trying to create some contact. Instead, I just feel depressed, and with that resolve to stay put and just wait it out. I then begin to make some effort to sort out what opposites are at play. She seems manic, and I feel depressed and abandoned. It gradually becomes clear that a pair of opposites are functioning through projective identification, with her depression put into me, or is it my mania put into her? Thus a state of two-ness is differentiating out of the oneness of fusion that had dominated. As Kate continues, I reflect upon my depressed state. At the same time, I began to wonder about its manic opposite, in Kate, and about fusion fears and desires. As this went on, my experience changed. Now I began to feel both opposites, a manic component and a depressive one. In von Franz's terms, I began to grasp the two aspect of the one by apostasizing the two into the qualities I have called mania and depression. In other words, a field quality of two-ness has become clear. The process of thinking in terms of her mania and my depression, along with splitting mechanisms, is largely a convenience, a way of grasping a quality of two-ness in an interactive field. Now I have a choice. What do I do with the two-ness? Several possibilities emerge. Having contained the opposites, I can choose to interpret the projective identification. It would be possible to tell Kate that she has been splitting off from depressive anxiety, having me contain it, and further relate this to her abandonment fears that arise when she is on the verge of success. In this instance, an emerging business issue was a source of joy that in turn terrified her, as did her emerging independence from me. If I proceeded in this way, the stage of two-ness would have led to three-ness in the form of an interpretation. Thus, holding the opposites together in consciousness, I could have chosen to interpret and hence to concretize the two aspect of the field. Instead, I chose to see, imaginally see. Metaphorically, I attempted to make imaginal contact with her by seeing, in William Blake's sense, through my eyes, rather than with them. This process involves a sacrifice of clarity, an act of lowering the consciousness gained in differentiating the field into the opposites manic-depressive, or of giving up some of the high-grade energy produced in this process. This is a process of becoming less conscious and less active, in a sense, dumb. It is an introverted act in which psychic energy, attention, and consciousness is given over to the unconscious and therein to a symbolic sense of oneness, the one continuum. This imaginal act is a background issue, something that is dimly perceived along with the act of seeing, of looking and waiting for something to appear, for some kind of sight to emerge. In a sense, during this activity I was looking at Kate as if she were a dream image or a process of active imagination. This can also be understood as a form of object usage in Winnicott's sense, which depends upon the transformation of a defensive projective identification field into a capacity for play. I begin to see her differently now. I see that she is terrified. While the opposites were split, imagination was blocked, and I could not see this, nor could I infer it from countertransference reactions. Once again, interpretation could now come forth as the third. I could interpret how Kate's splitting and hiding her terror of being seen. I could interpret, that is, how her splitting was hiding her terror of being seen. But there is another imaginal alternative. As I focus more energy on the unconscious, and in a sense on the one continuum, this energy can be felt to flow upwards and back towards the one, and then in a circuit that returns through my heart towards Kate. This focus is an effort, for the affects of the dyad that had preceded the potential of threeness include inertia. A fundamental quality of threeness is having overcome the sense of being stuck and leaden, the condition of inertia. It is out of this kind of heart-centered act that the field of projective identity is an aesthetic element. This has been explored by James Hillman in his paper, The Thought of the Heart. A perception of beauty lingers, a beauty of wholeness and its mystery that would have been destroyed by making the unconscious conscious. When I perceived Kate's terror and said nothing but just saw it, she said, "I've been avoiding you. I have been terrified of making contact. I am scared of sexual feelings and the vulnerability they bring." End quote. And now, still experiencing my imagination as heart-centered, something new begins to emerge. This time it is a vague image, a sense of the energy field or the space between us changing, becoming more textured and alive. It is neither in her nor in me. We both see and experience it. This is a subtle body experience. The conjunctio had emerged out of the two. In the axiom of Maria, out of the two came the three as the one. The appearance of the conjunctio can be recognized as a synchronistic event because of the simultaneous meaning it has for both of us. It represents a sacred event, a moment of grace, and perhaps also a result of faith and a background sense of oneness. Due to the sexual anxieties that were awakened in Kate, the opposites, held together by the conjunctio, did fall apart. The conjunctio disappeared into a negredo and left us eventually in a state of soullessness, a lack of contact that was the complete opposite of the sense of union afforded through the conjunctio. These are typical stages after the conjunctio experience. They correspond to pictures 6 and 7 of the Rosarium. But as usual, the conjunctio experience did not vanish. Rather, experience proves that in a series of unions and deaths, a pool of kinship libido slowly builds up. Generally, one does not explicitly go through the logic of the axiom, but I believe that it represents the process of dealing with opposites, especially in projective identification, which is more or less consciously carried out if any heart-centered act of vision or empathy is created. Further examples will deal more fully with the conjunctio. Here, I have emphasized transformative possibilities in the subtle body field which have an inherent logic and through which the conjunctio's appearance, while always an act of grace, can also be facilitated. In a sense, analysis is the art of moving from the two to the three. In the next section, I shall explore a very important form of two-ness, the unconscious couple that often underlies the behavior and activity of ego consciousness and relationships. The unconscious couple. In the psychology of the transference, Jung presented a model of the transference-countertransference phenomena. He proposed that the connection between analyst and analysand be understood as an interaction between 4 factors, 2 being the conscious attitudes of the participants, the other 2 factors being the anima and animus, the unconscious personalities of the male and female partners, respectively. Jung described the various connections between these elements, the most unconscious and determinative link being the man's anima and the woman's animus. He found this couple portrayed in the alchemical pictures from the Rosarium Philosophorum. As he says, everything that the doctor discovers and experiences when analyzing the unconscious of his patient coincides in the most remarkable way with the content of these pictures, end quote. In concluding his study, Jung says, quote, to give any description of the transference phenomena is a very difficult and delicate task, and I did not know how to set about it except by drawing upon the symbolism of the alchemical opus. The theory of alchemy, as I have shown, is for the most part a projection of unconscious contents, of those archetypal forms which are the characteristic features of all pure fantasy products, such as are to be met with in myths and fairy tales, or in the dreams, visions, and the manias of individual men and women. The important part played in the history of alchemy by the Hieros Gamos and the mystical marriage, and also by the Conjunctio, corresponds to the central significance of the transference in psychotherapy on the one hand, and the field of human relationships on the other, end quote. The picture series from the Rosarium centers upon a couple, with the Conjunctio, as in picture 5, being the central mystery. Others in the series do not necessarily have its quality. For example, picture 2 represents a fusion state in which incestuous energies play a major role, and picture 7 represents a state of total loss of relatedness. In psychotherapy, we generally at first find an image of an unconscious couple that is far from the desirable state of union. This couple can often be a representation of the patient's own parents, usually a portrayal of this couple as the patient actually saw them, imaginally saw them, but an image that was too difficult to accept. It can also be a composite form, complicated by the endless unconscious dyad. This is the type of image for which anima-animus interaction is a special case. A host of unconscious components can actually form the couple. At times of disturbance due to a severe countertransference, the couple may be largely the analyst's own. Awareness of the patient's unconscious couple is often a starting point, a prima materia. Identifying it, and eventually, as the following clinical material will show, seeing it in the intermediate region of subtle bodies can have a potent transformative action. This is probably only understandable in terms of the archetypal image of the Conjunctio and its symbolic link to the energy sea of the Unus Mundus. It would seem that the very awareness of an inner couple opens the way to that mystery. Examples of unconscious couples. I call this case Nora. Nora began her session with a yawn and handed me a check. I noted that it was an error, less 1 week's fee. In a usual playful manner, she said, "Don't make too much of slips like that. I'm just tired. And besides, I have wonderful news about my favorite subject, my supervisor." I finally stopped being a wimp and stood up to her. Her evaluation of my work was awful, filled with envy, and I confronted her on each point and got her to totally change it. End quote. This was an important event, a landmark in terms of her behavior with authority figures. To Nora, it was a culmination of months of analytic work oriented towards owning her own authority. Throughout these months, there had been a constant theme, her contempt for other people. Most everyone in her past and present, especially her supervisor, had been a prime target. Refrains such as their lack of strength, or their cowardice, or their refusal to be honest about what they believe were most common. In this session there was a just-so-ness about her story. There was no recognizable contempt for her supervisor. As she spoke, I still wondered about her initial yawn and slip about the check, but I could make little of it. Her outer success was very important, and I acknowledged that, but clearly more was happening than the manifest material. As in the technique of active imagination, I allowed my consciousness to lower and began to look at Nora through my eyes, not with them. In the imaginal process that occurred, I was also aware of being in my body. Now, through this lowered consciousness, a kind of perceptual haziness existed, through which my body surface seemed to expand, as if its energy field reached outward. Another way to describe this is to say that an experience of a new field between us slowly developed, a sense that the space that separated us gained a quality, became more material, and seemed to have its own autonomy in the form of a flickering of imagery. It is difficult to distinguish whether this experience is of the body or of the psyche. Both seem to participate. An imagination seems to arise out of this body-psyche field. As in the above example of Kate, at times this vision seemed to be of Nora's intrapsychic process, at other times of contents in a shared, subtle body field. Throughout this subtle body or somatic unconscious experience, I remembered her initial slip. What was it about? A dual vision is often essential to the imaginal process, as this and the following example will demonstrate. The imaginal act can often be structured by history, here by the initial data and its meaning in our process, and as it can relate to her past, but of which I could make no sense. And not only by history, but also by an acausal process, a spontaneous appearance of imagery through the somatic unconscious. This dual awareness into time-bound and atemporal forms has always structured imaginal activity and attempts to sort out true from false or fantastic imagination. One finds this duality central in mantic procedures, in Blake's structuring of vision through particularity in the divine Jesus, in alchemy, and in Bion's binocular vision. In the hour I've been describing, I initially saw Nora in her new state of feeling effective. This was a separation from internal persecutory images. I experienced her subject-object clarity, the sense that she was contained and was her own person. But in the more vague trance-like state that I descended into, I began to see a pocket of contempt in her. There was a sense of glee, quite split off from the separate and mature person she also was. Glee at the way her supervisor squirmed under her confrontation. The subtle body experience is often a background, a subliminal field of imagery against which we form interpretations and other cognitive acts. In psychoanalytic terms, it would be reduced to so-called primary process. In the kind of analytic activity that I am describing, this is reversed. The clarity of contents and process, especially developmental considerations, become a background issue. The more hazy and imaginal processes become more foreground. This may have some relationship to switching from left hemisphere to right hemisphere dominance. While her contempt was strong in the past, it was now imaginally perceptible but weaker and less intrusive. This, of course, is something one would expect. In such developments, there is always repression and some splitting. One could say that she was able to separate from the shadow of contempt, which now was in her unconscious as an inferior quality. But here I am stressing something different. It was not that more shadow integration was necessary, nor was any interpretation of the transference or countertransference especially useful. Rather, what proved to be important was an imaginal process. Here is how this came about. Having seen her contempt, I again returned to her initial behavior in the session, and I said, I think the contempt you have had, especially over the last few months, needs also to be seen as a contempt of me. Perhaps your yawn and underpayment is a sign of this contempt. To which she said, I don't think so. I can follow with my head, but it doesn't feel right. So I tried again. You have spoken about how limited our time is together. That could be a link to your father, who spent so little time with you, and for whom you have great contempt. Also, we have been spending a lot of time on outer, manifest levels, such as talking about your supervisor. I wonder if you experienced that, in part, as a message that I didn't want to directly relate to you. That could engender contempt. And she said about that, I'll think about it, but I don't think so. I think we had to deal on the outer level. Look what happened in the process. I'm finally standing up for myself. Well, throughout these interpretive interpretations, which soon felt feeble, I maintained an imaginal eye on her contempt, allowing it to become more background for the time being. I then felt more deeply into my body and waited for some image to emerge. Nora was now talking about her supervisor's physical size. She noted being much taller, overpowering her. She was belittling her size, putting her down, dismissing her. She mentioned enjoying making her supervisor cry during their confrontation. In several minutes, something began to vaguely appear to me, a combination of a hazy thought mixed in with what I was seeing in her in between us, and I said, "Perhaps what is going on now is that you and I are like your mother, your father, talking about your mother." I stumbled. I felt confused and was surprised over my lack of clarity. I thought I knew what I was going to say, but was tongue-tied, and mother and father got all tangled up. While I was trying to sort this out, she said, "Wait, maybe we are mother and father talking about me, Nora." With that, she was very reflective, immersed in thought, and looked away. She was experiencing something. I was more an onlooker at this point than a participant. With a suddenness, as if awakening from a dream, she said, "That's it. I always felt they were contemptuous of me, and I completely blocked it out. It seems they were always talking about me in the way I just talked about her." Nora's experience had a clear ring of truth to it. She had contacted a painful experience of a parental couple, their contempt for her, and her lifelong need to deny this awareness. She saw their contempt. In the next session, I learned that when she turned away, she felt she was in a place that was not fully in time. It had a strange quality she had never known before, a sense of mystery that was out of the ordinary. She saw her parents' contempt while in this trance-like state. This has all the qualities of an entrance into the somatic unconscious. It also bears similarities to liminal processes, rituals that occur in the subtle body state of awareness. Now, here are elements of the dream she had the night following her vision of her parental couple. Here's the dream. I am walking along a street. In the gutters are layers of dried eucalyptus or bay leaves and a rich, pure, finely textured topsoil, washed there by spring rains. The soil and leaves are light and layered. I look down and see a manhole cover, which is actually a grill. It is black, wrought iron, and octangular. The design is a Habsburg Zweiadler, a double-headed crowned eagle with one body. In its claws are a bundle of arrows. I lift it and look down and across the tunnel. It is well constructed, solid, and safe. The other end is about 10 yards away. I can see the opening. Outside it is golden and glowing warm, sunny and earthy. It's the end of the dream. Nora associated the topsoil to her initial dream and analysis of an Olympic-sized swimming pool filled with shit. Now it was transformed into the rich, aerated topsoil. One understanding we now gained of that remarkable initial dream was that it represented her psyche filled up by other people's projections. For example, she was a vessel for the contempt of her surroundings. As a result of her tendency towards idealization and fusion, she could not process these affects. They created a psychic and also physical constipation. Her psyche swallowed projections and could not expel them. This also explains her contemptuous attitudes towards others. It was an attempt to expel introjects, a lifelong process beginning with her parents' contempt of her and her splitting defenses. With her vision and ensuing dream, a change took place. The descent and light at the end of the tunnel was the potential for a birth of a self, an anal birth, a capacity to trust her spontaneity and especially her creativity. That proved to be a long-range process, an individuation, thread, and goal. But the remarkable immediate gain was ushered in by the double-headed eagle, the hermaphrodite, which is a central image of the rosarium, for example, picture 10. It represents, among other things, overcoming splitting. There is no question that her splitting defenses sharply diminished after this dream. Her need for idealization and her terror at seeing how contempt ruled her life was faced and changed. And her chronic mind-body splitting was on the way to being healed. For example, she dreamed of a young girl, 9 years old, who was recovering from an operation for a spinal cord injury. The little girl had a crescent-shaped scar on the back of her neck. The operation had been a success. She had been in a full body cast from early childhood. She was now out of the cast, fragile but recovering. Unfortunately, much more space is necessary to do justice to this process and its ramifications. One which merits mention here is the use of the contemptuous couple in the analysis which followed. When projective identification mechanisms would return, which happened mildly, but at times when she was afraid of embracing some creative task, I could recall the couple, often just to myself, at times to her. This would have the effect of imaginally creating the couple as a third thing between us, which in turn cleared the projective identification field. The next case is a case of a woman I'm calling Paula. Paula is a 40-year-old woman who entered analysis after many years of psychoanalysis from a developmental and a Freudian point of view. Her stated reason for seeing me, a Jungian, was a desire for a spiritual vantage point, but with someone who was also aware of these other disciplines. Sexual energies played a large role in Paula's life, and they also proved to be crucial to our analytic work. This became clear, however, only after 2 years of treatment, the time of the following verbatim. Paula, I want to be here and stay here today, not wandering in outer thoughts. I need your help. How can I help you? And she says, I don't know. I just know I want to stay here. I want to feel the excitement, be with it, not run away. And I told her, you are beginning to split now. This is something I inferred from the intensity with which I find myself fragmenting at the moment. I told her, your attention is wandering. Try to stay with the excitement. What fantasy arises? I asked. After a long pause, she said, it's difficult to just stay here and not split. The word not shouldn't feel this way with Father. Now at this point, with her and my own sexual excitement rising, the atmosphere of space between us begins to feel alive, vibrant. Both of us recognize this change. It is an example of an emerging and dual awareness of the somatic unconscious or the subtle body, a kind of texturing of space in which we both seem to be inside something that is also between us. This flickering awareness of the subtle body was not of a thing that is localized in space. It was sensed as a change in the feel of the space and time as perceived during the previous moments. It is completely insufficient to reduce this to regression. We were inside this experience and also outside, both aware of its autonomy and of our oneness with it. Our mutually implicit reference point in this dialogue from her previous work had been her father spanking her approximately from between the ages of 6 to 13, and her recollections of fantasies of his sexual arousal. She described the events as having an entrance phase set by her being nasty to her mother, then her father's telling her to go to her room and wait for him, the spanking in prescribed fashion, and then his exit as if nothing had happened. This all has a sadomasochistic tone that elicited a transitional, or in ritual terms, a liminal experience. This had been the material in the previous sessions, a reconstruction that had been made during the prior 2 months. With it, a link was made with her chronic history of sexually acting out with nearly all of the previous male analysts. She had also begun to feel sexual desires with me during the analytical hour. Her splitting was interpreted as a defense against these desires. She feared they would overwhelm her, override any control she might have, and lead to yet another episode of sexual acting out. As a result of her father's sexual abuse, and what she had now recognized as her Oedipal victory, which was a part of their ritual, she had been left with no recourse but schizoid splitting defenses. It was with these defenses that she had entered analysis. Years of work from an object relations, interpretive point of view, Gestalt work, and group therapy had failed to make a significant dent in her schizoid character structure. As I mentioned, nearly all her previous work with male analysts had led to sexual acting out, always with her fantasies being ones of impersonal, intense penetration. The men were generally either impotent or sadistic in their behavior, either during or after the sexual act. At the time of the session I'm describing, we had had several weeks of sessions in which a rather stable erotic field existed between us. This was a new development, but had always been attacked by splitting defenses and resulted in her typically schizoid in and out program, whereby it was very difficult to maintain attention on her, as if she would fade in and out of the focus during the hour. Now it was more stable. I may also add that her need to defend against these feelings was reinforced during the first year of analysis through various sexual affairs. Splitting off her Oedipal victory and the associated sexual and aggressive drives were analyzed, but Paula needed this defense. Acting out prevented an awareness of the sexual abuse by her father and dissipated her sexual feelings and anxiety in the analytical hour. That was the past. In the context of her desire to not dissociate and withdraw from me, I recalled this previous work, especially of the recurrent childhood event of her father's spankings and his sexual arousal. This work had led to an awareness that her father's sexual abuse of her created an unconscious transference couple. It was our unconscious dyad. In the session being described, I began to see this couple for the first time. As described in the previous example, this imaginal act is akin to active imagination. But instead of attention focusing on the unconscious as an inner reality, focus is on the unconscious out there, in the subtle body or somatic unconscious that have begun to constellate. My next remarks stem from this perception of the imaginal couple composed of Paula and her father in their spanking ritual. That is, there is Paula and I sitting in the room and imaginally perceiving a third thing going on, this ritual. And I said, "Can you sense a kind of energy field between us? As if there is an imaginary couple here, you and your father." And she says, "I'm not sure. I talked to my father recently. He was so forgetful. I sensed his impotence. I guess that's a loss of the Oedipal father. I feel your potency. What a relief. I guess I need both for the existence of these fantasies and feelings. I can sense the couple now, though, me and my father." To which I say, "I'm not sure how you and I and the couple connect. I don't sense the fantasy clearly." And she says, "I am over your legs on my bed. You are spanking me. I'm feeling the tightness, tautness of your arm hitting me, the tightness, tautness of your thighs and penis. It all blended, the excitement in your body. I can't tell whose excitement it is, mine or yours." Now, during this, my attention was on the imaginal couple between us and also on her. The structure of this is essential to grasp. I also discussed it in Nora's case previously. There are two objects, a couple made up of me and the patient, and the imaginal couple whose presence can be sensed and their form imaginally seen in the space between us. My attention was on both couples at once, oscillating or hovering between both of them. In response to her question, I do feel excited, and I choose to tell her, I am excited. That's to say, her question about where the excitement is. I told her I am excited. But then I was surprised to find that I also wanted to say, what do you want to do? The last question was a result of imaginally focusing on the transference couple, the drives and fantasies as I perceived them of the dyad. I felt slightly on the edge of losing boundaries, but also that not saying what I did would lead to breaking the field between us. It felt honest to ask the seemingly seductive question. At the same time, I had a stabilizing reference point to the triangle of the patient, the couple, and myself. And to my question, what do you want to do? Paula then says, I want to see your excitement. I want to undress you, to see it. At this point, the field intensity rises, and I begin to feel somewhat identified with the activity of the male in the couple. I was surprised to have the following fantasy emerge, and I told her, I want to penetrate you from the rear. To which she said, then do it. I want it too. Don't hide it. Now, engaged in my own feelings and vision of the couple, waiting to see what might emerge, the following thought forcefully occurred to me. What about Mother? To which she said, fuck her. It doesn't matter. All that matters is us. And I said, feeling it very strongly, I'm scared. And she said, I don't believe it. It's incredible. You'd leave me in it all alone because you're scared? Well, I'm not. She doesn't count. It doesn't matter what she thinks. But I'm scared. And she says, I feel hate, rage, awe, disbelief. You're a fucking bastard. You can't leave me in it alone. I feel a fury, a chaos, a splitting in my mind. Oh God, I don't believe it. I feel like a tornado inside me, fragmented, like my insides were just taken out of me, sucked out of me. You are denying your feelings and desires, and since we are merged, I have to deny mine or split them off. I can't trust. To which I said, I think that is just what happened to you with your father. I said this partly because some clarity seemed useful, but also to partially dampen what seemed to me to be a rising level of unconscious processes that could be overwhelming. After several minutes, reflecting in a new, uncharacteristic way, she said, so all his other denials of my sore throats, my anger and others, were just a screen for this primary denial. The only way I could then ever remain integrated was to be engaged in a mutually acknowledged sexual relationship. This is powerful. No wonder I've acted it all out. Mentors with unresolved mother complexes and unresolved father complexes. I remember one analyst with whom I couldn't collude, and I rationalized that he was incompetent. I continued to experience anxiety in the sessions because there was no mutually acknowledged desire. With my fiancé, I feel intact when I'm with him, and then when alone, during the middle of the week, my anxiety begins to rise. The only way to maintain cohesion is to be in a mutually desired sexual relationship. Otherwise, I lose cognitive skills. I can't think. I only regain them when I have a relationship. I've always thought that I had a learning disorder, or worse, some brain damage. End of quote. Now, it's important to underscore the features of our analytic work that accounted for the capacity for containment of the erotic energy field. I engage this field, especially with the question, what do you want to do, after a considerable amount of psychic integration had occurred in the analytical process. In the Rosarium imagery, one finds containment centering upon the image of the descending dove in pictures 2 to 4. This spiritual factor forms a tension with the lower erotic and aggressive energies, known in alchemy as the lion and the unicorn, that would tend to concretize the human relationship by identifying it with the unconscious couple. This is a constant hazard in the alchemical process. It results in a series of unions and deaths aimed at purifying away the concretizing tendency, the drive that obscures not only inner and outer, but also the awareness of the centrality of the in-between, the subtle body realm. This transformation process cannot occur without erotic energies, yet a spiritual reference point is critical. The descending dove represents not only the result of a transcendent vision, the unio mystica, nor only ecclesiastical wisdom. It is the carrier of a previous process that was known in alchemy as the unio mentalis. In alchemy, this unites with the dead body, leading to the body's renewal. This unio mentalis was accomplished by collecting parts of the personality, what we call psychic complexes, both through their analysis and also by engaging them with the imagination. But illumination, awareness of a transcendent light, was also necessary. Only then could the attempt be made to embody the product into the mind-body unity of the lapis, the alchemical lapis. In Paula's case, there had already been considerable work done towards mental unity through self-knowledge. Paula also had a spiritual level of awareness. While the unio mentalis could not be said to have been complete, it was sufficiently established to allow the kind of dialogue we engaged. The difficulty one often faces, however, is that the fullness of mental unity that is desired is itself only substantially achieved after the kind of subtle body experiences we engaged. There is always an element of risk and judgment involved. The concerns of the alchemical process for the existence of the unio mentalis are a good guide. This would also mean that considerable working through of the transference and countertransference had occurred. Anyone treating schizoid personality disorders knows how resistant certain psychic parts are to integration, and at the same time how much of the true self they contain. I think that the procedure I am here exploring is a possible aid to a treatment that employs a model of regression into early childhood. But I emphasize that a considerable amount of analysis on the level of mental consolidation, especially through transference analysis of projective identification and splitting, is essential before such erotic imaginal realms can be successfully approached. The expression of erotic desires in the analytic process has long been recognized to be extremely dangerous. Consequently, I have only allowed the verbatim material in Paula's case to be published and spoken about in public with some reticence. It certainly will be shocking to many people and not universally welcomed. It also will inevitably draw projections onto me, and that is an uncomfortable prospect. But it would be dishonest to withhold the material, especially since it was vital to the successful outcome of the treatment. I must again stress that the last thing I am suggesting in subtle body experiences is the free expression of the analyst's erotic thoughts, or any of his imagination. That is dangerous and unethical. These ideas may, however, spontaneously appear within an imaginal structure, as I have carefully explained in this paper. One part of this structure is historical and the other part is mythical, one determined by developmental considerations and the other by imagery. When erotic imagery and affects appear within a proper structure, they can further an entrance into a deeper level of transformation, in this case the central event of the conjunctio. As a result of our imaginal subtle body encounter, Paula had discovered, for the first time, the root of her severe anxieties and tendencies to withdraw, especially of her painful and chronic fear of having an organic brain disorder that she believed was responsible for the occasional loss of her capacity to think. The intense rage and despair she experienced at her father's denial was employed to attack any linking processes, especially inner thinking. By re-experiencing her trauma as we did, she finally understood and eventually gained mastery over her dissociative processes. In this case, what had been accomplished to now was an awareness of the unconscious couple that had been dominating our sessions and all of her relationships, and the activation of that couple in the imaginal here and now. I would like to emphasize the difference of this event from Gestalt-like enactment. I actually felt the desires I spoke of. I was totally in it, but my attention was in two places at once, with one lens on the transference couple and another on me and the patient. Both were complete in their own right, yet the simultaneous awareness of the two couples, the unconscious dyad representing an imaginal or mythical couple, and the patient and myself representing a present-day historical pair, led our statements to have a clear quality of truth. Previously, we had reconstructed the past, but we had not nearly succeeded in revealing the depths of her despair and dissociation. The reconstruction alone left us at an edible level. The imaginal replay plunged into the schizoid world of mindlessness that had plagued her entire adult life. There is no question that the drama we entered was enacted in a transitional realm. It was a subtle body experience. With this enactment, the intensity of her sexual and aggressive drives was revealed. But we had not gone very far in their transformation. What could aid this? She still tended to be overwhelmed by the sexual energies, and her only way to control them was still to find someone with whom to enact them. She now did have a suitable partner, and she was far more conscious of her history and psychological process than ever before. In the sessions which followed, there was less splitting, but still some fragmenting and a sense that she was not yet fully embodied. The in and out dynamic was still present, but at reduced intensity. She recognized its persistence and wondered how it might change. Her tendency was to believe that her present fiancé was the answer. I noted the defensive nature of this approach, saying that it actually solved very little and was probably fated to lead to a dead end in which her father and her husband were to be more and more fused. In this session, I shall now describe the transformative possibilities that reside in the conjunctio are clear. To now, we had been aware of a transference couple, an unconscious dyad that was raised to consciousness. But this dyad was comprised of personal images, and it may be said to stem from the personal unconscious alone. In the sessions I shall now describe, which came 4 weeks later, the dyad took archetypal expression, a couple in tantric union. I want to specially describe the transformative effects of this shared vision in the subtle body. There had been a development of particular importance. While alone, she began to do active imagination. In fantasy, she would attempt to return to her childhood bedroom and re-experience what had occurred. This often proved to be very anxiety-provoking, and she had to insert a different male figure in her father's place. Along with this imaginal activity, an insight emerged. Paula recognized that when she was hungry, she felt sexually aroused. She then wanted a penis to fill her void, any penis, which she recognized always meant her father's. At such times she would usually eat. Now she gained the courage to not eat and instead experienced her feelings and intense anxieties. This proved to be an important experiment. Through it, feeling hungry in a sense of being empty, at times succumbing to eating but usually standing her ground and experiencing her desires, Paula became more and more capable of entering into her severe anxieties and sexual aggressive arousal with her father as an inner image. These same affects could then be experienced with me during our analytical hours. In this session, she had felt hungry prior to her appointment. In the past, she would tend to eat before sessions. When she arrived, there was a mild in and out pattern. I noted this to her, and we spoke about it as a sign that sexual desires were present, and she feared they could overwhelm not only her, but both of us. Now that she had not acted out through eating, these desires were especially intense and palpable in the room. We knew them in the session I previously described. There they existed in the unconscious couple comprised of Paula and her father. Now they were even stronger. What can I do about this? What does one do with these feelings? They seem cut off from anything human. Do they change? To which I answered, you can talk about them. You can feel them, feel how they link to your father. They can't be solved by acting on them. Now, I soon realized that what I was saying made sense and was something calming to her, but I also recognized that I was repeating something like Freud's recipe of sublimation and repression. What I had been saying took me away from the depth experience and affective content. My approach had been just a shallow ploy to escape her question, do they change? Consequently, I stopped problem-solving, and only now did I begin to remember the session in which we experienced her and her father as an imaginal couple, and I recalled this to Paula. Soon something new began to occur. We could both imaginally see and experience a couple, but it was very different from the previous one. The couple seemed to hover in the space between us, engaged in a tantric-like sexual embrace that determined the energy field we experienced. This was an experience of a conjunctio. Previous to it, the energies we had felt were primarily sexual, but now a change occurred. The conjunctio experience, as always, brought us a sense of closeness, the I-thou state of kinship, or communitas, in Turner's the entire dream series which followed this experience, but space will not allow. Instead, I'll recount the last dream of a series of 4, all on the same theme of a change in her inner relationship to a male figure. Here's the dream. I'm in a boat, steering it. I don't know how it is propelled, but it moves slowly and gently in water that is aqua blue. Beauty and stillness is all around. I can see no land, just water. I feel safe, moving slowly ahead. I look to my left and I see a man is swimming in the water next to me. He seems like a composite of my father and fiancé, but his eyes are different from anyone's I know. He swims gently, carefully with me. He seems like my father at times, and when he does, he is about 40, my age. I see land ahead and continue staring. I think to myself that when we get to land, he probably won't go with me, but will keep on his way. This feels okay. As we approach land, I ask him about this, and he says, I'll come with you. It feels safe, like he is a partner. I awake to the jolt of the boat hitting up against the shore. Repeating. The result of the conjunctio experience in this beautiful dream culminated in the integration of an inner figure, the animus, neither purely a synthesis of introjects nor only an autonomous image of the objective psyche, but a combination of both. As a consequence of this dream, for example, when her fiancé left her for several days or when she left analytic sessions, she had no strong loss experiences, no feeling, as she said, of a hole in her stomach, accompanied by frantic wanderings or need to sleep. These reactions had been diminishing all along, especially after the imaginal experience of her father and herself as an unconscious dyad, but they sharply diminished after the conjunctio, the archetypal level of union. In Tantra, after this, her attention was even more fully in the treatment, and fears of sexual flooding were no longer an issue. Change, a newly won sense of being embodied, was firm. Prior to her subtle body experiences, the only time she knew embodiment was during sexual intercourse. Now she also knew it while doing everyday things alone. Generally, after the animus birth dream, she had, for the first time, an inner companion and very little depressive or persecutory anxiety. The dream I cited is the culmination of a series of dreams in which Paula's relationship to her animus developed. There had been dreams of stabilizing each other on an icy path, and of his leaving on a bus, yet throwing his wallet and money to her to follow with no panic of loss on her part. Through the many years of earlier analytical work, she had never had dreams of inner supportive figures. After the conjunctio experience through the subtle body, dreams and ego integration often change in a radical way. At times, one conjunctio experience is a key event. At other times, a series of such experiences occurs over several years, eventually with transformative results. How it is propelled with the following comment, that from a clinical point of view, one must ask about the effects of subtle body experiences. The fact that they occur is not news. The fact that people know they have been through something unique, something different from any previous experience, is also common. But these testimonies alone tell us very little. We often hear similar things about drug experiences, which then have little effect upon behavior and one's sense of self in the return to a more normal consciousness. We know dreams that follow the subtle body interaction. We really have nothing truly solid to go on, and that's why I've stressed these as our main evidence.